watching 5 German soldiers move through the morning mist toward his position. It's 7:42 in the morning on May 27th, 1940. His name is Jack Churchill. He's 33 years old, 14 years out of Sandhurst Military Academy, and he has 0 confirmed kills in combat. And the British Expeditionary Force, the pride of the British Army, was in full retreat, running for the coast. Around him, the entire world seems to be coming apart at the seams. The Wehrmacht had already crushed Poland in just 36 days. Churchill's own company had lost 11 men in the past 72 hours. The Germans had better tanks, better aircraft, and far better coordination. British soldiers were dying by the hundreds, along every road leading to Dunkirk. Officers were burning classified documents in roadside ditches. Sergeants were burying equipment they couldn't carry. Some soldiers were actually throwing away their rifles just to run faster. He was crouched behind that wall, holding a 6-foot English longbow, with a 70-pound draw weight. A weapon with an effective range of 200 yards in the hands of an expert. Just 11 months earlier, he had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo, finishing 26th out of 63 competitors from 14 nations. The retreat had become a rout, but Jack Churchill was not running. And Churchill was absolutely an expert, not a champion by any stretch, but good enough to put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards, good enough to kill a man before that man ever heard the shot. The German patrol was now at 30 yards. Churchill could clearly see the sergeant leading them, a veteran, judging by the careful, measured way he moved, probably a man who had already fought through Poland. The sergeant was doing everything right, scanning the hedges, checking windows, looking for the standard threats. Rifles, machine guns, grenades. He never once thought to look for a medieval weapon. Churchill drew the bowstring back to his ear. The yew wood creaked under the tension. His fingers found the familiar anchor position on the string, the exact same position he had used 10,000 times in practice. He had made this shot countless times against targets. He had never made it with a human being at the other end. The arrow flew. The German sergeant dropped without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his chest. It was the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century. And it happened because one British officer refused to accept that modern warfare had made ancient weapons irrelevant. Now here's something worth pausing on, because there's a lesson buried in this moment that goes well beyond military tactics. Jack Churchill didn't pick up that longbow out of stubbornness or eccentricity for its own sake. He had done his homework. He understood something that a lot of modern thinkers miss. Old tools aren't automatically obsolete just because new tools exist. The longbow had something a rifle didn't silence. No muzzle flash, no gunshot crack, no sound that could betray a position or scatter a patrol. In the specific context of a close-range ambush in foggy morning conditions, the primitive weapon was actually the smarter choice. There's a practical ethics lesson here too. Churchill chose the tool that minimized chaos and collateral risk in a situation where a firefight could have gotten his own men killed. For everyone involved. Is something worth carrying into your own life, whether you're solving a business problem, a team conflict, or a personal challenge. The British Expeditionary Force eventually evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th, 1940. Most of them left behind their weapons, their vehicles, their equipment, and a great deal of their dignity. They came home defeated and exhausted, fully expecting a German invasion within weeks. Jack Churchill came home with his bow, his sword, and his bagpipes. He had covered his company's retreat, and he had killed enemy soldiers with weapons that belonged in a museum. And here's the thing, he was just getting started. Now, you might be asking yourself, who is this man? How does someone end up on a World War II battlefield with a longbow? Because the story of how Jack Churchill arrived at that moment, frankly, as fascinating as the moment itself. Churchill had graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1926 and served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma. He spent a decade learning to be a conventional infantry officer and then quit the army entirely in 1936 because peacetime soldiering bored him nearly to death. That's not a metaphor. That's just who he was. He went to Nairobi and worked as a newspaper editor. He appeared in films as an archer and bagpipe player, including a small role in The Thief of Baghdad. He rode motorcycles 1,500 miles across Burma and India, once crashing into a water buffalo on a rural road. When war broke out in September 1939, Churchill immediately rejoined his regiment, but not as a normal officer. He brought his longbow, the same one he'd used in international competition. He brought his Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore of the type his ancestors had carried into battle centuries before, and he brought a set of Highland bagpipes he had taught himself to play during his years in Burma. His fellow officers thought he was eccentric at best and mentally unstable at worst. His commanding officers thought he was a liability. The War Office had no regulation covering officers who wished to carry medieval weapons into battle against panzer divisions armed with 88mm guns. Churchill had studied military history extensively, and he understood something that pure firepower advocates consistently overlook in close combat. In the chaos of an ambush, in the terror of hand-to-hand fighting, psychological warfare matters just as much as raw firepower. A man charging at you with a broadsword and a Highland war cry is more terrifying than a man pointing a rifle from behind cover, because your brain has no training protocol for the first scenario. Churchill didn't care what any of them thought. And here's where it gets really interesting from an educational standpoint. It freezes. It hesitates. In any competitive environment, the move your opponent hasn't prepared for is often more effective than the move that's technically superior on paper. And in combat, a second of hesitation is the difference between life and death. This is a principle that applies far outside war. Disruption isn't just a Silicon Valley buzzword. It's a survival strategy that Mad Jack Churchill had figured out before most modern business theorists were born. So within weeks of returning from Dunkirk, Churchill did exactly what you would expect from a man like this. He volunteered for a new unit the War Office was secretly assembling. They called themselves the Commandos. The training would be brutal, beyond anything the British Army had ever attempted. The missions would be suicidal raids into Nazi-occupied territory. By December 1941, he would be leading men onto a frozen Norwegian beach at dawn. Bagpipes screaming into the Arctic wind. Broadsword raised above his head, about to prove that sometimes the oldest ways of war are still the deadliest. The casualty rates were expected to be catastrophic. Churchill requested permission to bring his sword and bow on operations. The Commandos said yes. The British Commandos were born from desperation. In June 1940, Britain stood essentially alone against Nazi Germany. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, no relation to Jack, demanded a force that could strike back at the enemy, even if only to prove that Britain was still fighting. The army had lost most of its equipment at Dunkirk. An invasion felt imminent. The concept was simple but brutal. Small teams of highly trained soldiers would raid the coastlines of occupied Europe. They would destroy facilities, kill Germans, gather intelligence, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. The missions would be dangerous. The training would be harder. Volunteers only. Jack Churchill volunteered immediately. He joined No. 3 Commando in late 1940 and threw himself into the training program with everything he had. The Commandos trained in Scotland, in the mountains around Achnacarry Castle. They marched 30 miles a day carrying full equipment. They practiced amphibious landings in freezing water. They learned to kill silently with knives, garrots, and bare hands. They fired live ammunition over each other's heads during exercises. Men who couldn't keep up were sent back to their original units in disgrace. Churchill excelled at everything. He was older than most of the volunteers, but he was stronger and more determined. And he brought skills that no other commando possessed. He could put an arrow into a target at 200 yards, play the bagpipes while marching into battle, and handle a broadsword with the skill of a medieval knight. He could march longer, shoot straighter, and fight harder than men 10 years his junior. The other commandos didn't know what to make of him at first. Some thought he was showing off. Others genuinely wondered if he was sane. But as the training progressed, they began to understand his logic. Churchill wasn't carrying ancient weapons because he thought they were superior to modern firearms. He was carrying them because he understood something deeper. War is not purely a technical problem. It's a psychological one. A German soldier facing a rifle knew what to expect. He had trained against rifles. He understood the threat and had a mental response ready. But a German soldier facing a screaming man with a sword and bagpipes had no training for that situation. And the order came down from Combined Operations Headquarters for a major assault on a German garrison at Vagsø, a small island on the Norwegian coast. His mind would freeze for a critical second while it tried to process what it was seeing. And in combat, that second is everything. The operation was codenamed Archery. The target mattered strategically. Vagsø controlled access to a network of fjords that German ships used to transport iron ore from Sweden. The island housed around 150 German soldiers, 4 coastal artillery guns, and an anti-aircraft battery. The town of South Vagsø contained fish oil factories the Germans were using to produce glycerin for explosives. The plan called for a dawn assault on December 27, 1941. Royal Navy cruisers would bombard the German positions. RAF bombers would provide air cover. Then, the Commandos would land on multiple beaches simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders before they could organize. Churchill studied the intelligence reports obsessively. He requested permission to lead the first wave onto Moy Island, a small fortified position guarding the approach to South Vagsø. Permission granted. He then requested permission to carry his sword and play his bagpipes during the assault. Permission also granted, though several senior officers quietly questioned his sanity. The night before the raid, Churchill checked his equipment one final time. His broadsword was sharp. His bagpipes were tuned. The Commandos loaded onto their transport ships on Christmas Day, 1941, and sailed north through the Arctic darkness, past the coast of Scotland, into the Norwegian Sea. He had grenades, a revolver, and a Thompson submachine gun as backup. But he intended to lead the charge with steel and music. Temperature dropped below freezing. Ice formed on the deck railings. Men huddled below, checking weapons, writing letters home, trying not to think about what was coming. Churchill spent the voyage studying maps and rehearsing signals with his men. He had 105 commandos under his direct command. Their objective was to neutralize the German shore battery on Moy Island within 10 minutes of landing. If they failed, the entire operation would collapse, and hundreds of British soldiers would die in the freezing water. At 8:45 on December 27th, the transport ships reached their launch position 12 miles off the Norwegian coast. The landing craft were lowered into the black water. Churchill took his position in the bow of the lead craft, bagpipes in hand, sword at his belt. The landing craft approached Moy Island through a curtain of smoke. RAF bombers had dropped smoke canisters along the shoreline to blind the German gunners. MS Kenya was firing salvos at the shore battery, her 6-inch guns thundering across the fjord. Explosions lit up the Norwegian coast like lightning. Churchill stood in the bow, fully exposed to enemy fire. The other commandos crouched behind the steel gunnels. Their commander remained standing. The shore was 200 yards away, then 150, then 100. At 8:48 a.m. on December 27th, 1941, the ramp of Churchill's landing craft dropped onto the rocky beach of Moy Island. Churchill stepped forward into the freezing surf and began playing The March of the Cameron Men. The sound of the bagpipes cut through, the explosions and gunfire like a blade through cloth. It was the most Scottish sound in the world, and it was coming from a beach in Nazi-occupied Norway. The Germans in the shore battery heard it and couldn't believe what they were hearing. They had been trained to fight British soldiers with rifles and grenades. They had not been trained to fight a man calmly playing music while walking toward their guns. Churchill finished the tune, set down his bagpipes, pulled a grenade from his belt, and hurled it at the nearest German position. Then he drew his broadsword and charged up the beach, screaming at his men to follow. The assault on Moy Island took less than 10 minutes. The 4 coastal artillery guns were destroyed with explosive charges. The anti-aircraft battery was overrun and captured. The raid on Vagsø was the first major commando success of the war, and it made Jack Churchill famous or infamous, depending on which side you were on. The German commander was taken prisoner along with 15 of his men. He became known across the British military as the officer who played bagpipes into battle. The madman with the broadsword, Adicinto. Newspapers ran stories about him. Commanders requested him for their operations. The War Office stopped questioning his equipment choices. There's a lesson worth sitting with here. Churchill had been mocked, questioned, and dismissed for years because of his unconventional choices. His weapons looked ridiculous in the context of modern industrialized warfare, and yet those same choices, applied with genuine skill and strategic intelligence, produced results that conventional approaches hadn't. This is something that comes up again and again in both history and everyday life. The people who are most frequently dismissed as eccentric or impractical are sometimes the ones who've simply understood the problem differently. The question isn't whether your approach looks normal. The question is whether it works and whether it's grounded in genuine understanding rather than just contrarianism for its own sake. Churchill wasn't random or reckless. He was deeply studied. There's a real difference between those two things. And Canada landing on the southern coast of the island in the first 3 days. By the summer of 1943, Churchill had been promoted to commanding officer of No. 2 Commando. No. 2 Commando landed at Catania on the eastern coast under Churchill's command. He came ashore carrying his complete arsenal Scottish broadsword at his waist, longbow and arrows across his back, bagpipes tucked under his arm. His men no longer questioned any of it. They had seen what he could do at Vagso. They trusted him completely. The fighting in Sicily was brutal. The Germans had reinforced the Italian garrison with elite parachute troops and panzer divisions. Every village became a fortress. Every road became an ambush site. By September, Sicily had fallen, and the Allies were preparing to invade mainland Italy. The plan called for landings at Salerno, south of Naples. Intelligence suggested the Germans were expecting an attack further north, near Rome. The Salerno beaches would be lightly defended. The invasion would be manageable. The intelligence was wrong. No. 2 Commando landed at Salerno on September 9th, 1943, and immediately encountered fierce resistance. Churchill's commandos were assigned to defend a critical road and rail junction at the town of Vietri sul Mare, overlooking the western half of the Bay of Salerno. The Germans had anticipated the invasion and reinforced the area heavily. The beachhead came under heavy fire within hours. If the Germans captured Vietri, they could pour artillery fire onto the Allied beaches, and the landing force would be destroyed. For 5 consecutive days, Churchill and his men held Vietri against repeated German counterattacks. They fought from buildings, from ditches, from rubble. They repelled infantry assaults and tank probes. They called in naval gunfire on German positions and refused to give ground even when ammunition ran low and casualties mounted. Then, on the night of September 14th, Churchill received new orders. German forces had occupied the hills above the town of Molina, controlling a strategic pass leading down to the Salerno beachhead. An observation post on those hills was directing artillery fire onto Allied positions. It had to be eliminated. Churchill studied the terrain. A frontal assault would be suicidal. The Germans had machine guns covering every approach, mortars zeroed in on the obvious routes. Any large force would be detected and destroyed before reaching the objective. So he made a different decision. He would take a single corporal and infiltrate the German positions at night. 2 men could move silently where 200 could not. 2 men could capture what 200 could not take by force. Churchill and the corporal left the British lines after midnight. They moved through the darkness, using terrain for cover, avoiding German sentries by crawling through drainage ditches and along stone walls. The night was black, and the Germans were not expecting an attack from 2 men armed with a sword and a revolver. They reached the first German position just before dawn. Churchill spotted the glow of cigarettes in the darkness. A German mortar team, relaxed, not expecting trouble. He drew his broadsword and approached silently. He appeared out of the darkness like a ghost from another century. The Germans surrendered immediately. They had never seen anything like this officer with his medieval weapon and his absolute calm. Churchill used his revolver lanyard as a makeshift rope to lead the first prisoner to the next position. He repeated the process. Each time he approached silently, revealed himself suddenly, and demanded surrender. Each time the Germans complied. They were too shocked to resist. By dawn, Churchill and his single corporal had captured 42 German soldiers and an entire mortar squad. They marched their prisoners back down the path to the British lines, with the wounded Germans placed on carts and pushed by their fellow prisoners. Churchill later described the scene as something out of the Napoleonic Wars. He received the Distinguished Service Order for the action at Molina. The citation praised his courage, his initiative, and his leadership. It did not mention that he had accomplished the entire capture with a sword. Some things, apparently, were too unusual even for official military records. There's something ethically remarkable about this episode that's easy to overlook. Churchill had every justification, under the rules and conditions of war, to kill those German soldiers. Instead, he consistently chose capture over killing when capture was achievable, even when it was more dangerous and more difficult. Is one of the hardest things a person in a position of power can demonstrate. That choice reflects a kind of moral discipline that's worth respecting. The Salerno beachhead was secured by September 20th. Churchill and his commandos continued to operate ahead of the main force raiding German positions, capturing prisoners, disrupting enemy communications. The Allies began their long advance up the Italian peninsula toward Rome. His reputation had spread beyond the British military. German soldiers began telling stories about the British officer with the sword and bagpipes. They called him a berserker, a madman, a throwback to an earlier age. Some refused to believe he was real, and Churchill received orders transferring No. 2 Commando to Yugoslavia to support partisan fighters against German occupation forces. What happened next in Yugoslavia would push Jack Churchill to the absolute edge of everything he was, and for the first time in the entire war, the edge would push back. Others simply hoped they would never encounter him. The mission would be dangerous, the terrain brutal, and the Germans would be waiting. The Germans in Yugoslavia had heard the stories about Jack Churchill long before he arrived. Intelligence reports had circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters, describing the British officer who carried a sword and played bagpipes in combat. Some officers dismissed it as propaganda. Others took it seriously. All of them underestimated what he was actually capable of. By the spring of 1944, Yugoslavia had become one of the most savage theaters of the entire war. German occupation forces controlled the cities and major roads, but communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito dominated the mountains and forests. The fighting was merciless. Prisoners were rarely taken on either side. Entire villages were destroyed in reprisal attacks. The British government decided to support Tito's partisans with weapons, supplies, and military advisors, and the Commandos would provide direct combat support for partisan operations. The Germans had deployed over 500,000 troops to Yugoslavia and were still losing ground. Churchill threw himself into the new mission with characteristic intensity. He studied the terrain, learned the partisan tactics, and planned operations against German supply lines. The partisans were genuinely impressed by his aggression and his willingness to fight alongside them as an equal, not as a superior advisor giving orders from a safe distance. The first raids were successful attacks on German outposts, equipment destroyed, prisoners captured, and a German garrison of several hundred soldiers held fortified positions overlooking the beaches. But in May 1944, Churchill received orders to capture the German-held island of Broch. Churchill assembled a mixed force, 43 commandos from No. 43 Commando, a troop from No. 40 Commando, and approximately 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. The landing on Broch was unopposed. The Germans had pulled back from the beaches to prepare defensive positions in the hills. But then the operation began to unravel. The partisans were supposed to advance immediately toward the German positions. Instead, they hesitated. Their commanders looked at the strength of the German fortifications and decided to wait until morning. Churchill was furious. Every hour of delay gave the Germans time to reinforce, time to prepare, time to call for support. Knowing that the element of surprise, the one advantage that small forces have over large ones, had been surrendered. Number 43, Commando launched a flanking attack on the German positions, while Churchill led elements from Number 40 Commando in a direct assault up the hill. But he couldn't force the partisans to attack. The assault began the following morning. The partisans remained at the landing area, providing no support. Churchill and his commandos were entirely on their own. The Germans were ready for them. Machine gun fire swept the approaches. Mortar rounds exploded among the advancing men. Churchill pushed forward anyway, bagpipes playing, sword at his side, urging his men up the slope by sheer force of will and example. And then a German mortar team zeroed in on Churchill's position and fired a salvo of rounds directly into the group of commandos gathered. Around their commander, the attack stalled. Men were falling. Ammunition was running low. The explosions killed or wounded every man in the group except Churchill himself. He survived only because he had been standing slightly apart from the others, playing his bagpipes to encourage the attack. Think about that for a moment. The thing that saved his life was the very thing his colleagues had mocked him for years earlier. Churchill found himself alone on a hillside in enemy territory. His men were dead or dying around him. The Germans were advancing toward his position. He sat down on a rock, picked up his bagpipes, and began playing Will Ye No Come Back Again, a Scottish lament, a song of farewell, a final act of defiance against an enemy that had finally, after years of trying, caught up with him. His ammunition was exhausted. Escape was impossible. So he did what any officer of his particular character would do. The Germans approached cautiously. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. A British officer, surrounded by the bodies of his men, playing music while they pointed rifles at him, too respectful of a man who faced death with that kind of composure. They didn't shoot. A German grenade eventually exploded near Churchill, knocking him unconscious. When he woke up, he was a prisoner. They were convinced that anyone named Churchill must be related to the British Prime Minister, and they flew him to the capital under heavy guard, hoping to extract valuable intelligence about Allied plans. The Germans transported Churchill to Berlin for interrogation. They were disappointed. Jack Churchill had no connection to Winston Churchill. Frustrated, the Germans sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin, a special compound for prominent prisoners, including politicians, resistance leaders, and suspected relatives of important figures. Churchill was placed among men who had plotted against Hitler, men who had defied the Nazi regime at the cost of everything, men who went to sleep each night not knowing if they would be executed in the morning. Got this hint. He was not privy to strategic secrets. He was simply an officer who liked swords and bagpipes. For most prisoners, Sachsenhausen was the end. For Jack Churchill, it was merely an inconvenience. Within 4 months, he would escape. He was placed in a special section called Sonderlager A, reserved for prominent prisoners who might have value as hostages or bargaining chips. And 3 Royal Air Force officers who had participated in the Great Escape from Stalag Luft 3 in March 1944, 50 of whose comrades had been executed by the Gestapo after that attempt. These 3 had survived only because they were considered potentially valuable. Churchill immediately began planning his own escape. He studied the camp layout, the guard rotations, the fence lines, the watchtower positions. He identified weaknesses in the perimeter, and he recruited allies among his fellow prisoners. Within weeks of his arrival, he had a plan, working at night and concealing the excavated dirt under piles of compost. The prisoners in Sonderlager A had access to a small garden area near the perimeter fence. They used spoons, pieces of scavenged metal, and their bare hands to claw through the earth. The tunnel extended 110 meters, passing under the fence and emerging in a wooded area beyond the camp perimeter. On September 23rd, 1944, Churchill and 4 other British officers crawled through the tunnel to freedom. They emerged into the darkness beyond Sachsenhausen and scattered into the German countryside. Churchill paired with squadron leader Bertram James, one of the great escape survivors. Their plan was to walk north to the Baltic coast, approximately 200 kilometers away, and find a boat to neutral Sweden. For 2 weeks, Churchill and James moved through Nazi Germany on foot. They traveled at night and hid during the day. They stole vegetables from fields and drank from streams. They avoided roads, towns, and anywhere Germans might notice two ragged men who didn't speak the language. The weather was turning cold. Their clothes were wholly inadequate. They had no maps, no compass, no supplies beyond what they could steal. They made it to within a few kilometers of the Baltic coast before their luck ran out. A German patrol spotted them near Rostock, demanded identification, and of course, they had none. They were arrested, identified as escaped prisoners, and returned to captivity, but not to Sachsenhausen, Garrutism. Churchill was transferred to a camp in Austria, deep in the Alps, far from any Allied lines. The war was clearly turning against Germany by late 1944. The Soviets were advancing from the east. The Allies were pushing through France toward the Rhine. But for a prisoner in an Austrian mountain camp, liberation seemed impossibly distant. Churchill spent the winter of 1944 to 1945 as a prisoner, watching Germany collapse around him. Allied bombers flew overhead daily. News filtered in about Soviet advances, about the fall of Berlin, about Hitler's increasingly desperate orders. The guards became nervous and uncertain, aware that they might soon face justice for what had happened in these camps. In late April 1945, Churchill and approximately 140 other prominent prisoners were transferred from Austria to the Tyrol region of northern Italy. The SS planned to use them as hostages bargaining chips in negotiations with the advancing Allies. The prisoners were marched through the mountains under heavy guard, not knowing whether they would be released or executed. The end came in an unexpected way. A delegation of prisoners approached senior Wehrmacht officers and expressed their fear of being murdered by the SS. The Wehrmacht officers listened. A German army unit moved in to protect the prisoners, and after a tense standoff, the SS withdrew. The prisoners were abandoned in a small Italian village free, but stranded deep in what was still effectively enemy territory. Most of the liberated prisoners did the sensible thing. They waited for Allied forces to arrive. Jack Churchill did not wait. He had been a prisoner for nearly a year. He had escaped once, been recaptured, and survived. He began walking south toward Allied lines, covering 150 kilometers on foot through the Italian Alps, crossing mountain passes and avoiding German stragglers. He was not going to sit in a village while there was still a war to fight. His ankle was injured. He had no food, no weapons, no identification documents. He walked anyway. After 8 days, he reached the town of Verona and encountered an American armored reconnaissance unit. The Americans didn't know what to make of the ragged British officer who appeared out of the mountains claiming to be a commando lieutenant colonel. Through the stories he told of swords and bagpipes and German prisoners captured at knife point in the dark, he had no documents, no uniform insignia, nothing tangible to prove who he was. The Americans sent him back to Britain through military channels. Churchill arrived home in May 1945, just as the war in Europe was ending. Germany had surrendered. The concentration camps were being liberated. The fighting in Europe was over. But the war was not over. Japan was still fighting in the Pacific. Thousands of Allied soldiers were still dying in Burma, in Malaya, across the islands of Southeast Asia, and proved that the old ways still had meaning in the modern age. Jack Churchill was on a ship heading east toward Burma and toward what he genuinely believed would be the final chapter of his war. Churchill immediately requested a transfer to the Far East. He wanted to fight the Japanese. The War Office approved his request. He had no way of knowing that 2 atomic bombs were about to change everything. Churchill was somewhere over India when the bomb fell on Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. A single American B-29 had dropped a weapon that killed 80,000 people in an instant. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over. He had spent months preparing for the invasion of Japan, studying Japanese tactics and fortifications, planning to lead commandos onto Japanese beaches the same way he had done in Norway, Sicily, and Yugoslavia. Churchill received the news with what can only be described as bitter disappointment. Now there would be no invasion, no final battle, no chance to test himself against one more enemy. He reportedly complained that without the American atomic bombs, the war could have gone on for another 10 years. It was a dark joke, but it revealed something true about who he was. He was a man who found genuine meaning in the controlled chaos of combat, who felt most fully alive when the stakes were highest. The British military did what institutions always do with people who don't fit the peacetime mold they assigned him to administrative duties. Staff positions, training roles. Peace, for Jack Churchill, was a foreign country. He wasn't built for it. And he knew it. His service record was extraordinary. Distinguished Service Order with bar. Military Cross with bar. Mentioned in dispatches multiple times. He had fought in France, Norway, Sicily, Italy, and Yugoslavia. He had escaped from a Nazi concentration camp. By 1947, he was transferred to Palestine as second-in-command of the 1st Battalion Highland Light Infantry, arriving into one of the most volatile situations on Earth. He had captured 42 prisoners with a sword. And now they were asking him to do paperwork. Jewish refugees from the Holocaust were flooding into the territory demanding a homeland. Arab Palestinians were resisting what they saw as an invasion of their land. British soldiers were caught in the middle, trying to maintain order while both sides treated them as the enemy. The violence escalated throughout 1947 and into 1948. Then, on April 13th, 1948, a convoy of Jewish medical personnel was ambushed on the road to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. The convoy carried doctors, nurses, students, and patients. Arab fighters attacked with rifles and Molotov cocktails. 77 people were killed in what became known as the Hadassah Convoy Massacre. Churchill organized the evacuation of the surviving medical staff who were now trapped on Mount Scopus, surrounded by hostile territory, and Arab leaders to arrange safe passage, moving through contested areas with the same calm authority he had shown on battlefields across Europe. 700 Jewish doctors, students, and patients were evacuated from Mount Scopus under his protection. When asked later about his approach to those dangerous negotiations, Churchill offered a characteristically simple explanation, and a refusal to show fear could accomplish what firepower could not. People were less likely to shoot at someone who was smiling at them. This is actually one of the most underappreciated principles in leadership, and it shows up in Churchill's life again and again. The first one, standing in the open when everyone else was crouching, and that visibility, that willingness to absorb the psychological weight of danger on behalf of the people depending on him, generated a level of trust and loyalty that no organizational chart or title could manufacture. He never led from behind. There's a real lesson there for anyone in a position of responsibility in a company, in a family, in a community. People follow the person who is willing to stand in the open. Churchill retired from the British Army in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He was 52 years old and had served for over 30 years. And his retirement was, naturally, as unconventional as everything else about him. He developed a passion for radio-controlled model boats, building elaborate warships and sailing them on ponds near his home, breathing connection to the commando traditions he had helped create. He refurbished old steamboats and piloted them along the Thames between Richmond and Oxford. Churchill would ride the train home from London each evening, and as the train passed his neighborhood, he would open the window and throw his briefcase out onto the tracks. His daily commute became legendary among fellow train passengers. Startled passengers assumed he had completely lost his mind. In fact, Churchill had calculated the exact spot where his garden bordered the railway line. The briefcase landed in his backyard every single time, saving him the trouble of carrying it from the station. Holding a homemade surfboard and watching the water for signs of the tidal bore a wave that traveled up the river from the Bristols. Channeled twice each day, it was perfectly logical. It was also completely mad. It was, in other words, exactly who he was. Local fishermen thought he was out of his mind. They had watched waves on the Severn for generations, and it had never occurred to any of them to try to ride one. Churchill paddled out into the brown water and waited. The bore appeared as a white line on the horizon, moving upstream against the current. He caught it and surfed it for over a mile upstream, becoming one of the first people in Britain to ride a river wave. It was exactly the kind of absurd, unnecessary, slightly dangerous activity that had defined his entire life. He was not content to watch the wave pass. He had to be on it, had to feel it beneath him, had to master it the way he had mastered the longbow, the broadsword, and the bagpipes. When people asked about his wartime exploits in his later years, Churchill was modest. He didn't boast about the Germans he had killed, or the prisoners he had captured. He didn't claim credit for victories that belonged to others, particularly over a glass of wine in the evening, but he never sought attention or recognition for any of it. Churchill's quiet confidence in his own story is a kind of ethical model worth noticing. He told the truth, which was extraordinary enough without embellishment. There's something genuinely admirable about that. He didn't need external validation because he wasn't doing any of it for external validation. He was doing it because it was who he was. He had outlived most of his comrades from the Commandos, most of his fellow prisoners from Sachsenhausen, and most of the men he had led into battle across Europe, surrounded by family, a lifetime removed from the frozen beaches of Norway and the burning hills of Yugoslavia. One British newspaper struggled to capture his life in an obituary and eventually wrote that if Churchill had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. Jack Churchill died on March 8th, 1996 at the age of 89. No fictional hero with his story would seem credible. A man who killed enemies with a longbow in the age of tanks. A man who captured prisoners with a sword in the age of machine guns. A man who played bagpipes while mortars exploded around him. A man who escaped from a Nazi concentration camp and walked 150 kilometers to freedom. A man who surfed river waves and threw briefcases from trains and refused to accept that the modern world had no place for medieval warriors. Jack Churchill was not the most decorated soldier of the Second World War. He was not the most successful commander or the most brilliant tactician. He didn't win any decisive battles or change the course of history through strategic genius. What he did was simpler, and maybe more important. And enough willingness to be genuinely different could accomplish what entire armies could not. In the special operations forces that traced their lineage directly to those Scottish training grounds, he proved that individual courage still mattered. He proved that unconventional thinking could overcome superior firepower. It lives on in every soldier who has been told that something was impossible and refused to believe it. And honestly, it lives on as a challenge to all of us, because Churchill's deepest lesson isn't about war at all. To use the tools that actually fit your understanding of the problem, rather than the tools that look most acceptable to everyone watching. To stand in the open when everyone else is crouching. To play the bagpipes when the world is on fire. Do us a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps us bring more forgotten stories like this one to people who would never otherwise hear them. Because we are in the archives every single day, pulling out the stories that history almost let slip through the cracks. And to never, ever throw away your bow just because the man next to you has a rifle. Stories about officers who captured prisoners with swords. Stories about soldiers who played bagpipes under mortar fire. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Norway. Our community stretches across the entire world, and you are not just a viewer. So, stories about men who escaped concentration camps and walked across mountains to fight again. Real people, real courage. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you had ever heard of Mad Jack Churchill before today. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching.